Hello. My name is Beverly Clark, and I am 72 years old. Once upon a time, my life was as steady as the ticking of an old pendulum clock in the library, where I spent my days surrounded by the smell of dust and paper. But one day, on a perfectly ordinary autumn day, that pendulum broke. And since then, the silence I loved so much has begun to sound different. Today I'm going to tell you a story that will make you think twice before letting a stranger into your home. By the way, write in the comments where you are listening from. I'm curious to know where this story found you. Shall we begin? The silence of the library at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is a special kind of silence. It is not dead, like in an empty house, but alive, breathing. It smells of old paper, floor wax, and time. At 72, I valued it more than expensive perfume. Here, among the shelves of local history, I could be more than just Beverly Clark, a widow with too big a house and too quiet a life. I could be a researcher, mentally wandering the streets of Philadelphia 200 years ago. That day, I was looking for a book on Victorian architecture in the Centennial Hill neighborhood. My fingers slid over the spines, lingering on familiar titles, when a voice sounded right behind me.
The Stone Chronicle of Philadelphia. An excellent choice, although I would recommend supplementing it with Aldrich's work on cast iron.
I turned around, startled. A man was standing in front of me. 70 years old, I would say. Very upright, neat gray hair styled with unfailing elegance, and the calmest blue eyes I had ever seen. He was dressed in a dark gray tweed jacket, and he smelled not of tobacco, as one might expect, but of fresh grass and something else, something elusively expensive. You know Aldrich's work? I squeezed out, feeling myself blush like a little girl. The book was a highly specialized bibliographic rarity.
Of course, I used to dabble in architectural history myself. Arthur Briggs, pleased to meet you.
Beverly Clark, I said, automatically extending my hand. His fingers were dry and warm, his handshake firm but not strong.
Mrs. Clark, forgive my intrusion, but I couldn't pass by. These days, it's so rare to meet someone who isn't on their phone, but in a living, paper tome. It gives me hope.
We stood by that bookcase for 20 minutes, talking about Neo-Gothic and the Greek Revival, the whims of old architects and the city's lost gems. He spoke intelligently, not lecturing, but as an equal. He listened attentively, nodding, and his questions made me think, recall details that seemed to have been covered in dust forever. There was a certain completeness to his whole appearance, the confidence of a man who knows his worth and has no need for vanity. When the librarian began to turn off the overhead lights, signaling that closing time was approaching, Arthur looked at me with a slight regret.
I'm afraid they're kicking us out. You know, Mrs. Clark, the cafe across the street serves excellent espresso and apple strudel that would not be out of place in a Viennese coffee house. I would be flattered if you would keep me company. Unless, of course, you have other plans. I had no other plans. My plans were a solitary dinner in front of the TV and a quiet evening with a book I was already rereading for the third time.
I'd be delighted, Mr. Briggs.
Please, call me Arthur.
We stepped outside, where the autumn sun was gilding the brick facades. He gently took my elbow, helping me down the library steps, and his gesture was so natural and gallant that I didn't protest in the slightest. His car, a dark burgundy sedan, was clean and tidy inside. He turned on classical music, something by Mozart, but turned it down so it wouldn't interfere with our conversation. Sitting at a table in a cozy cafe, listening to his calm voice and looking at his well-groomed hands, I caught myself thinking something that hadn't crossed my mind in years. The thought was simple and frighteningly clear. My God, how tired I am of being alone. He walked me home. When we arrived at my house, he got out of the car to open the door for me.
Thank you for a wonderful evening, Beverly. I hope I wasn't too intrusive.
Not at all, I replied, my voice sounding a little hoarse. It was the most enjoyable day I've had in a long time.
Then let's hope there will be more. Philadelphia still has many secrets. It would be much more interesting to explore them together.
I stood on the porch, watching the taillights of his car disappear into the twilight haze. The silence of the house I entered no longer seemed cozy to me. It was loud. It was empty. I walked over to the living room window overlooking Rose's house. The light was on in her dining room, and I saw her silhouette. She was sitting at the table, alone, drinking tea. Just like me. Always like me. But today something had changed. Today, Arthur Briggs had appeared in my quiet, predictable life. And the air seemed to ring with this change. I took it for music. I didn't yet know that it was the first, barely audible ring of broken glass. After that day in the library, my life, which had been flowing calmly and predictably for many years, suddenly found itself in a rapid whirlpool. The rhythm changed from adagio to a stormy allegro, and to my own surprise, I did not try to resist it. Arthur didn't just enter my life, he gently and persistently filled it with himself. Our communication was uninterrupted. In the morning, a concise text message wishing me a good day. In the afternoon, a call to share a funny note from the newspaper. In the evening, at a new meeting. He was a master of hints and nuances, and his every gesture seemed to say, "I see you. And I find you interesting." He brought bouquets not of lush roses, but of modest, delicate wildflowers, which, as he remembered, I loved. He didn't take me to noisy restaurants, but to intimate watercolor exhibitions, to quiet parks where we could walk for hours, talking about everything under the sun. He asked me about my work, about my late husband, not with greed, but with respectful interest, as if he were piecing together a map of my soul. And in his eyes, I saw not just an elderly woman, but the very same Beverly who once boldly drew up plans and argued with clients. He gave me back my sense of self-worth. My house, which for many years had held only echoes of the past, was filled with new sounds. Arthur's velvety baritone reading poetry aloud, quiet laughter in the kitchen where he helped me cook dinner with amusing seriousness, the poignant melody of old jazz standards to which we sometimes danced in the living room, in the moonlight streaming through the window. I caught the gaze of my neighbor Rose when he walked me home. She stood at her window, her face impenetrable, like the stone mask of a Gothic cathedral. But in her eyes I read not condemnation, but rather wariness. I attributed this to her natural skepticism and jealousy of the sudden happiness that had come my way. He proposed exactly 2 months after we met in the library. Not on one knee, not with any grand gestures, but quite naturally, sitting on a bench in our favorite garden. He took my hand, covered with a thin web of wrinkles, and said simply, looking straight into my eyes, "Beverly, I don't want to say goodbye to you at the door anymore. I want to wake up and fall asleep knowing you are near. Let me spend the rest of my days taking care of you." His words lacked the passion of a young man, but they had the firm, calm confidence of a mature man. It sounded like a vow, not an emotional outburst. And I agreed, easily and without a shadow of a doubt. My heart, chilled by years of loneliness, craved this warmth. The wedding was quiet, almost secret. We signed the register at the town hall, surrounded by a couple of random witnesses. I wore a simple cream dress, and he wore that same tweed jacket. Stepping onto the steps, he took my arm, and his hand was warm and firm. The sun blinded my eyes. I looked at our carrier pigeon cooing on the cornice and thought it was a good sign. I didn't know then that pigeons could be scavengers, and that a warm hand could hold a poisoned blade. We crossed the threshold of my, now our home. The door closed and silence fell, but this time it was different. It was filled with his presence. I was happy. I was blind. The honeymoon period of our marriage lasted several weeks, filled with the same sweet, intoxicating peace. Arthur was the embodiment of care. He made breakfast, chose books for me, and every morning his first glance seemed to say, "How lucky I am to have you." My home became a cozy nest that smelled of fresh baking and expensive coffee, and the creaking floorboards at night no longer sounded ominous, because it meant I wasn't alone. But gradually, like autumn fog, the first doubts crept in. It started small. One day at dinner, he gently placed his hand on mine.
Honey, you deserve a break from all these boring chores. Let me take care of the paperwork. At least the bills.
His smile was warm, but his eyes were inscrutable. Lulled by his attention, I agreed with relief. Paying bills was indeed tedious. Soon he started talking about insurance.
Since we are now one family, it makes sense to combine everything. It will save money and eliminate unnecessary hassle.
He negotiated with the insurance agent himself and brought the papers for me to sign. I signed them without even looking, overwhelmed with gratitude for his business acumen. Then it was the house's turn.
Beverly, this house is our shared nest. But if something happens to me, you'll have problems with the inheritance. The procedure is tedious. It's better to put my name on the documents right away, for simplicity's sake.
He said it so naturally, caring about my peace of mind. And again, I saw it as nothing more than a manifestation of love. But it was then, for the first time, that a chill ran down my spine. Something clicked inside me. I looked at him, well-groomed, composed, impeccable, and suddenly realized with acute clarity that I knew almost nothing about his past. Once I asked him if he had any old friends he would like to see. He froze for a moment, and something elusive flashed in his eyes, not sadness, but rather wariness.
Old friends are like old books, dear. Some have been lost, others have gone. Now all I need is you.
And I wanted to believe him. I clung to that belief like a drowning man clings to a straw. But a crack had already appeared. It was thin as a hair, but it was there. And through it, a cold, uncomfortable wind of doubt began to seep into my golden cage. I dismissed these thoughts, calling them the ravings of an ungrateful old woman. But the seed had been planted, and it waited for its moment to sprout into fear. It happened on one of those perfect days that now seemed fake to me, like a stage set. Arthur had left on urgent business, another blurred detail of his biography that I preferred not to notice. The house was blissfully quiet, and I decided to tidy up the garage, which had turned into a storage room for someday useful items. Dust hung in the air, glistening in the ray of light from the dusty window. I was rearranging boxes of Christmas decorations that I hadn't taken out in years when suddenly my gaze fell on it. An old, worn khaki suitcase, pushed into the far corner, behind the water heater. I had never seen it before. It felt rough and cold to the touch.
I was going to throw it away.
I remembered his voice a week ago when I asked him about a box. He said it easily, casually, and I immediately forgot. Now that phrase echoed ominously in my ears. Inside the suitcase, it smelled musty and of someone else's past. There were a few things lying there, shapeless and faceless, a crumpled shirt, a pair of socks. And at the very bottom, hidden beneath them, was a dark blue booklet. A passport. My heart skipped a beat, sensing something bad. I opened it, and my world turned upside down. Arthur was looking at me from the page with his photo. 10 years younger, with slightly darker hair, and without the radiant wrinkles around his eyes that I had already grown to love. But it was him. The same direct gaze, the same firm oval face. And under the photo was a foreign name that burned my eyes like a hot iron. Robert Harris. I froze, unable to take my eyes off those letters. There was a deafening roar in my ears. The air became thick as syrup, and I could hardly breathe. Fragments flashed through my mind, his vague stories about the past, the absence of old friends, the ease with which he took control of my life, his impeccable, almost deliberate perfection. Not Arthur Briggs. Robert Harris. The ice broke, and the iceberg hidden beneath the water slowly, inexorably began to rise. All the idyll, all the happiness that had warmed me for the past few months, crumbled to dust in an instant, revealing the ugly, frightening truth. I had proof in my hands. Proof that the man who slept in my bed and called me his wife was not who he claimed to be. And the most terrifying question, the one that made my blood run cold, was simple and inevitable. If he lied about his name, what else was a lie? The next few days passed in a blur. Robert Harris's passport lay at the bottom of my jewelry box, under a layer of silk scarves, and its presence burned through the wood and fabric. Every sound of Arthur's footsteps on the stairs made my heart pound wildly. Every affectionate smile he gave me now seemed like a creepy, calculated mask. I needed a professional. Someone who would see not a hysterical old woman, but the cold facts. I found a private detective agency in the phone book and, waiting for Arthur to leave for the club, dialed the number with trembling fingers. Martin Grover's office smelled of cheap coffee and dust. He himself, a man with a tired face and a worn jacket, listened to my story with the look of someone who had already made up his mind as soon as I crossed the threshold. I placed my passport in front of him like a joker, the last argument of a sane person. He glanced at the document, barely looking at it, then typed something on his computer keyboard, his face expressing nothing but boredom.
Mrs. Briggs, Robert Harris died 3 years ago. Officially. Your husband probably just bought a fake document. Maybe for some petty scam. It happens.
But why? Why would he do that? I gasped, feeling the ground slip away from under my feet. He shrugged.
Who knows? Maybe he's hiding from alimony, maybe loans. But there's no basis for a criminal case here. No one's going to pursue it.
I tried to talk, to insist, to tell him about the insurance, about the house, about how perfectly he had fit into my life. But Grover just shook his head, and in his eyes I saw what I feared most, outright pity mixed with irritation.
At your age, ma'am, sometimes, your memory fails you. Your imagination plays tricks on you. Maybe you're just lonely and looking for drama where there isn't any?
The words hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. To him, I was not a client, but just another lonely pensioner with quirks. He didn't see evidence, he sighed. I left his office feeling like I had an invisible stamp on me, the stamp of a paranoid old woman. The city noise, the bright daylight, it all seemed alien and hostile. I was left alone with my truth, which no one but me wanted to see. And with the understanding that if this man, whose job it was to believe the facts, didn't believe me, then the police would just nod politely and show me to the door. I walked down the street, and every passerby seemed to me to be a possible accomplice of Arthur, every glance a mockery. The cage I found myself in was cleverly constructed. Its walls were universal disbelief, and its lock was my own loneliness. Despair is a quiet, cold companion. It settled in my house, becoming its rightful owner. I rushed from room to room, listening to the creaking floorboards, the sound of the engine starting in the garage, every step behind the door. Robert Harris's passport burned my soul, but I was afraid to return it to its place in the garage. What if Arthur noticed? But keeping it with me was even more frightening. My gaze kept returning to the window behind which Rose's house stood. Her silent, disapproving presence, which I had so diligently ignored, now seemed to be the only anchor in this raging sea of lies. She was sharp and cynical, but in her eyes I always saw a sober, unclouded mind. And she was not in love with Arthur. Plucking up my courage as if preparing to jump off a cliff, I invited her over for evening tea. Not to the living room, where everything reminded me of Arthur, but to the glassed-in veranda overlooking the garden, neutral territory. She came, as always, without saying a word, and sat down in a rocking chair, her hands on her knees. I silently poured tea into porcelain cups, my hands trembling slightly as they clinked against the saucers. "Rose," I began, my voice hoarse and uncertain. "I need to tell you something. You'll probably think I'm crazy." I told her everything. Slowly, with agonizing pauses. About the passport. About going to the detective. About his words about memory and loneliness. I expected a smirk, a condescending pat on the hand, advice to pull myself together. But Rose listened silently, without interrupting. Her wrinkled face was like an old map, cracked by time, but there was not a trace of doubt on it. She looked at me with her clear, slightly slanted eyes, and in them I saw only focused analysis. When I fell silent, exhausted, only the ticking of the old clock hung in the air. Rose slowly raised her cup, took a sip, and set it down with a quiet but distinct thud.
Detectives are fools. They see what they want to see. Old woman equals hysterical. Case closed.
She looked at me directly, and in her gaze flashed the very steel determination I had once suspected in her.
Old women, Beverly, have only two advantages. First, everyone ignores us. We're part of the landscape. We're invisible. And second, we've seen it all in our lifetime. Meanness, cowardice, greed. Nothing can surprise us. So enough with the detectives. They won't find anything. Let's check everything ourselves.
There was no pity or panic in those words. There was only simple, inexorable logic. And for the first time in many days, I felt the weight of fear and loneliness lift from my shoulders. I was not alone. I had an ally. And this ally was more dangerous than any detective because her weapons were age, inconspicuousness, and a complete lack of illusions. Our quiet investigation began the very next day. It turned our lives into something like a spy novel, where every little detail mattered and trust was a weapon I had to turn against my own husband. Rose took care of the technical side. Her medical background gave her both composure and access to resources. The DNA plan was her idea.
Fingerprints can be wiped away, but what he leaves in his mouth, he can't lie about.
I watched with horror and admiration as she seized the moment when Arthur went for a walk, put on white gloves, and, with the dexterity of a magician, took his toothbrush from the glass in the bathroom and carefully scraped a few bristles into a small sterile container she had brought from her home first aid kit.
A friend of mine at the lab will analyze it anonymously. We'll check if our Mr. Briggs Harris is listed in the databases as a particularly dangerous criminal.
My role was much more sophisticated and psychologically difficult. I had to play myself, but weakened, confused, the very old woman that people thought I was. I started small. I forgot to turn off the light in the living room, lost my glasses, which were on my forehead. I asked Arthur 3 times what day it was and pretended I couldn't remember the name of his favorite restaurant. And it worked. I saw how his eyes, at first wary, gradually lit up, not with alarm, but with triumph. He saw his wall of resistance crumbling, and he liked it. His concern became more patronizing, almost fatherly. He took my hand more and more often when we went down the stairs, as if I could no longer do it myself. He poured me wine himself, saying, "Drink up, dear, it will calm you down." And in his voice I heard not pity, but the satisfaction of a predator seeing his prey weaken. One evening, when I again pretended to get confused while recounting my day, he smiled that broad, flawless smile that had once captivated me and put his hand on my shoulder.
It's okay, Beverly. I'm always here. I'll take care of everything.
And at that moment, I realized that our game was working. His confidence grew, and his caution melted away before my eyes. He began leaving his phone unlocked on the table, talking louder and louder on the phone in his office, no longer always closing the door. He felt safe, in control, almost the master of my life and everything that belonged to it. Rose and I exchanged silent glances over the fence as he drove away in his car. We didn't say a word, but I knew what she was thinking. The trap was closing. But we still didn't know what kind of animal we had caught. Fear became my second skin, a familiar, cold lump in my stomach that didn't go away even in my dreams. But it was this fear that made my senses so sharp and my mind so clear and ruthless. I noticed that Arthur, returning from his walk, always went straight to the shower, not to wash away evidence, but to wash away the feeling of the streets, a different breath, another world in which he existed apart from me. That day, I heard the lock click in the bathroom, and a moment later, the sound of water. My heart pounded, echoing with dull thumps in my temples. His tablet lay on the coffee table, a dark and silent challenge. I knew the password. Once, pretending to be completely confused, I asked him to help me unlock mine, and he smiled indulgently and pointed to his. "Look, dear, it's our date." The happiest number. The bitter, cynical irony of this thought made me swallow hard. My fingers, cold and stiff, trembled as I entered the fateful numbers. The screen came to life. I wasn't looking for anything specific, feverishly swiping through the icons. And then I found it. First, a folder called Clients. Inside was correspondence with a woman named Susan from Arizona. The same pattern, admiration for her wisdom, stories about the architect's past life, questions about her health and her country house. My stomach churned. Then my fingers stumbled upon a file with the innocuous name Will_draft. I opened it, and the world shrank to the size of the screen. It was a will in my name, drawn up so that all our jointly acquired property, my house, my savings, would pass to him, my loving spouse, in the event of my death. Everything was legally flawless, which made it 1,000 times more horrible. And finally, the scans. Airline tickets. to Anchorage and from there to a small, remote village in Alaska, surrounded by mountains and glaciers. The tickets were purchased in my name. One way. The dates were a week away. I was shaking so hard that I almost dropped the tablet. There was a deafening ringing in my ears. He didn't just want my money. He was planning my death. Distant, lonely, the kind that could easily be written off as an accident in the wilderness. At that moment, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out with numb fingers. A text message from Rose.
He just Googled accidents while hiking in Alaska. Get out of the house. Now.
The cold terror that had gripped me before was suddenly replaced by adrenaline, sharp and clear. I don't remember how I put the tablet back in its place, threw on the first coat I could find, and slipped out the door. The sound of water running in the shower still came from the bathroom. He was there, just a few feet away, planning how he would kill me. And I, his future victim, already knew about it. And I was going to do everything I could to make sure his plan failed. I slammed the gate behind me and practically ran across the street. My legs were shaking, my heart was pounding in my throat. I didn't knock, but burst into Rose's house, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. The living room was dimly lit, smelling of medicinal herbs and old wood. Rose stood in the middle of the room, clutching an old-fashioned pair of binoculars. Her face looked carved from stone in the twilight. Tickets, the will. I tried to say, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. Rose silently approached me, took me by the shoulders, and sat me down in a deep leather armchair. Her touch was firm and strangely soothing.
Breathe, Beverly. Just breathe. I know everything.
She walked over to her desk, opened a secret drawer, and took out a stack of printouts. Her movements were measured, without fuss.
You're Arthur. His real name is Robert Harris. But you already know that. What you don't know is.
She placed the first printout on the table in front of me, a news article from a provincial Idaho newspaper. Elderly couple dies in country house fire.
Edith and Harold Myers sold their business 6 months before their death, took out large insurance policies. Witnesses said that in recent months they had often been seen with a relative, a gallant man in his 60s who helped them around the house.
I looked at the black and white photos of smiling elderly people, and a shiver ran down my spine.
Next is Martha Wilson. She bequeathed her entire fortune to a new friend she met on a cruise. The description of the friend matches your husband perfectly.
She methodically and emotionlessly laid out the puzzle of his crimes before me. There was a teacher from Florida who drowned during a romantic swim in the moonlight. There was an antique collector from Virginia who died of a drug overdose a month after an assistant appeared in his life.
He specializes in lonely, vulnerable people who have something he wants to take. He insinuates himself into their lives, becomes family. And then, an accident happens. Always an accident. No traces, no evidence. Just grief and closed cases.
I sat there, unable to take my eyes off the faces on the printouts. They looked at me from the photos, happy, unsuspecting. Just like me a few months ago. Why hasn't he been caught yet? I whispered.
Because he's a ghost, Beverly. He changes names, cities, legends. He leaves no witnesses. And the police won't connect the death of an old man in Arizona with a fire in Idaho. To them, these are accidents. But for him, it's business.
She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not only cold fury, but something else, pain.
I was a nurse, Beverly. I saw the aftermath. I saw the bodies being carried out. And I always thought, if someone had been a little more attentive, if someone had warned them.
She fell silent, pressing her lips together. And in the silence of her living room, the full horror of my situation finally dawned on me. I wasn't just another victim. I was part of a long, bloody chain. And Alaska wasn't just a trip for me. It was the end. I looked up at Rose, whose eyes were filled with tears, not of fear, but of fierce determination. What do we do? I asked. Rose slowly put the printouts back in the drawer.
Now we catch him.
Rose's words hung heavy in the air of her living room, heavy and relentless as a sentence. We'll catch him. Not save ourselves, not run away, but specifically catch him. That meant staying. That meant looking into the eyes of the man who had planned your death and smiling at him. It was the most difficult role of my life. The plan was simple, like all genius plans, and precise, like a scalpel. We turned his own weapon, his contempt for two old women, against him. If he thought I was weak and helpless, I would become that. Only under my own control. The next day, the show began. At breakfast, I stared at the toaster with a wistful sigh. Arthur, dear, this thing, it's flashing red again. I don't remember what that means.
It's okay, my love. I'll figure it out.
I forgot our neighbor's name, calling her that nice lady with the dog. I left the bathroom faucet running, and when he came running at the noise and was astonished to find a puddle on the floor, I looked at him with a confused, frightened look. I think I just wanted to wash my face. I saw his initial wariness melt away with each passing day, giving way to growing impatience and, worst of all, pleasure. He liked this power. He liked that his brilliant plan was working even better than he had expected. He became less cautious. He stopped hiding his phone and began talking louder and more openly on it in his office, thinking that I wouldn't understand anything anyway or would forget it right away. 3 days later, he canceled the tickets to Alaska. I accidentally, pretending to look for my purse, overheard his conversation with the airline. There was no disappointment in his voice, only businesslike confidence. That evening, he put his arm around my shoulders. His breath was warm against my temple.
You know, dear, I've been thinking, this trip to Alaska is too long and tiring for you. I found something better. A cozy mountain resort, just a couple of hours away. Fresh air walks. We need this romantic getaway while you're still able to enjoy it.
His words were wrapped in cotton candy care, but I heard steel underneath. He was in a hurry. My decline was apparently progressing faster than he had anticipated, and he wanted to get it over with quickly, before I completely lost touch with reality and my sudden death. In the mountains seemed like the logical conclusion to a sad but natural journey. I pressed myself against him, making my face soft and grateful. "Oh, Arthur, that sounds wonderful. You always take such good care of me." He kissed me on the forehead, and his lips were cold. I could feel his heart beating, even and calm. The heart of a killer, confident in his impunity. He bought new tickets. For the day after tomorrow. The game was entering its final stage, and my life was at stake. The evening before the trip was marked by exquisite cruelty. Arthur prepared my favorite dinner, pasta with truffles, which I once jokingly called my last wish. Bitter irony hung over the table like a third, uninvited guest. He was especially tender. His smile was gentle, his touch caring, but his eyes remained cold and calculating, like a surgeon preparing his instruments. He poured wine into thin crystal glasses, humming a tune under his breath. I watched his movements, how his fingers lingered slightly on one of the glasses, and my heart skipped a beat. It was him.
To us, my dear, to our trip, and to everything that lies ahead.
I raised my glass, smiling at him with my silliest, most trusting smile. To us, my love. I brought the glass to my lips, but at the last moment my fingers suddenly relaxed. The dark ruby liquid spilled onto the tablecloth, flooding it with a scarlet stain that looked like blood. "Oh my God!" I cried out with feigned horror. "I'm so clumsy. I'm sorry, dear." Arthur flinched, and a flash of anger crossed his face, but he immediately regained his composure.
It's okay, it's okay. I'll get some napkins. Sit tight.
He headed for the kitchen. His footsteps faded in the hallway. I had maybe 10 seconds. The trembling passed, replaced by icy concentration. I acted quickly and silently. I put my glass, which was almost full, back in its place. His glass, from which he had already taken a sip, went back to its place. My heart was pounding in my temples, but my hands were steady. When he returned with a sponge and napkins, I sat looking guilty, staring at the stained tablecloth. "How careless of me," I muttered.
It's nothing. Let's drink before the wine goes flat.
He picked up his glass, now mine, and took a few big gulps. I pretended to take a sip from his glass, barely wetting my lips. We finished dinner to the sound of soft music. He talked about the mountains, the fresh air, how good it would be for us there. And I watched. And waited. 15 minutes passed. At first, he just fell silent in the middle of a sentence. Then he ran his hand over his forehead.
Something's wrong. My head is spinning.
He tried to stand up, but he swayed and fell heavily back into his chair. His gaze, cloudy and unfocused, fixed on me. And suddenly, understanding flashed in his eyes. Terrible, final understanding.
What? What have you done?
At that moment, there was a sharp, insistent ring at the door. I didn't move. I just looked at him, and for the first time in all these months, my smile was genuine. The door opened. Rose was standing on the threshold, and behind her were 2 police officers.
It seems your husband is not feeling well. And it seems he just confessed to attempted poisoning. We have a recording.
Arthur tried to say something, but only an incoherent moan escaped his throat. His body went limp, and he slid from his chair to the floor. One of the officers was already leaning over him, while the other was taking out his radio. I slowly got up from the table, looking at the sprawled body of the man who had been my husband. There was no joy, no triumph. Only emptiness and the bitterness of a long war that had finally ended. The silence that returned to my home after all this nightmare was different. It was no longer ominous or lonely. It was well-deserved, deep, like a long-awaited breath after holding my breath. It was broken only by the chirping of birds outside the window and the steady drip of coffee from my old machine, the sounds of a simple, normal life. The case of Arthur, or rather Robert Harris, unraveled like a ball of yarn, revealing more and more black holes in his past. Armed with our evidence and DNA test, investigators quickly found threads linking him to at least 2 accidents that claimed the lives of lonely elderly women in other states. They found an entire archive on his computer, files on potential victims, draft wills, research on remote, uninhabited places. He wasn't just a con man, he was a methodical, soulless predator. Now he had to answer for everything. I sat on the porch, the very place where Rose and I had once begun our investigation. The autumn sun warmed my face. Rose, sitting opposite me, put down her cup. Finally, she said,
The silence here is deafening. After all that.
Yes, I agreed. Too much silence. I looked at her house across the street, just as cozy, just as deserted. We were 2 lonely old women who had fought a monster and won. But what was left after the battle? Rose turned her determined face toward me.
I have too much space, and you have too much silence. That empty cottage on the edge of town by the forest. It's for sale, with a large plot of land.
I looked at her, not understanding. So what? I asked.
Let's buy it, and open a shelter there. For old dogs. The ones everyone has written off. Because, as it turns out, we need someone to take care of. So we don't go sour.
Her words hung in the air, filled with the aroma of tea and last year's leaves. A shelter. For old dogs. It was so unexpected, so far from anything I could imagine as life after. And at the same time, it was perfect. It wasn't an escape. It was a continuation. A fight against another kind of loneliness. Creation instead of destruction. I looked at my friend, this tough, unyielding woman who had become closer to me than a sister. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt a smile spread across my face. A real one, without a trace of sadness, fear, or bitterness. The smile of someone who saw not the end, but a new, albeit unexpected, beginning. You know, Rose, I said quietly. That's a wonderful idea. She chuckled, raising her cup for another toast, this time to the future.
Of course it's wonderful. It's my idea.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this difficult story. Sometimes it seems that you cannot cope with trouble on your own, but help can come from where you least expect it. The main thing is not to be afraid to trust your heart. If this story resonated with you, please support our channel by subscribing and clicking the bell icon. There are many more stories ahead that are worth hearing. I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever found support when you least expected it?